These are all characterized by the marks of advanced age. So one sees lines on the forehead, on either side of the mouth, around the eyes, distinct crow's feet, unusually aquiline noses, irregularly shaped heads, receding hair, if there is in fact any hair at all. So it looks more or less as if every man in the Roman Empire who had his portrait made in the second half of the 1st century BC was incredibly old, no matter how young they might have been. If you look at the corpus of Roman portraits from the period of about 60 to 40 BC, which is when these are traditionally dated, you'll find that there are about 350 of them scattered throughout the museums of the world, including a few on the 3rd floor in the Roman gallery of this building. And there's always been a question as to why this particular type develops when it does, and what it meant to the Roman viewer. We know what it means to us. We think of probity and an ethical code and republican values because it's so directly connected to the idea of Republican Rome, and we've seen it revived several times. But there have been a lot of questions about the origin and development of this type, which still persist, although new excavations in the Galilee, in Israel, especially at the site of Kadesh, have yielded a phenomenal amount of new information that enables us to fix the origin of the portraits a little more clearly in time and to speculate about the formal sources and what they might have meant. If one begins to study the portraits, one finds that all of them that exist, all 350, are marble. And I'll come back to that at a later point because that proves to be more interesting and more critical to the significance of these portraits than I had initially realized. If you look at the coinage produced between roughly 60 and 40 BC, you see that the Bearistic type, which is the way I'm going to define this type characterized by sags, bags, and wrinkles, is the normal type on coinage. So it's something that we begin to see on coinage in the 2nd quarter of the 1st century BC, and then it goes out of use with the 2nd triumvirate, with the group of 3 men, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, who begin to take over the Roman world in the 30s BC. So at least on coinage, it has a fairly limited period of popularity. Now, the fact that it begins to appear in the 2nd quarter of the 1st century BC doesn't mean that that is the inception of the type, because it's only at this point that we get obverses of coins that focus on a full head of an individual. So we've always speculated that it starts at an earlier point. We just weren't sure what that earlier point was. People have often looked at Delos, the island in the center of the Aegean, for additional information about the origin of this type, because one finds it on Delos in contexts that date to a slightly earlier period. And I'm showing you the complex that's called the Agora of the Italians. This is a forum or a complex on Delos, which was the center for Italian businessmen on the island. There was a great deal of traffic from west to east, of course, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, and the slave trade was especially active, and one of the centers of the slave trade was the island of Delos. And one of the organizations most directly involved in the slave trade were the Italian businessmen whose headquarters were here. The excavation of the Agora of the Italians, and this is dating roughly to about 100 BC, has yielded a series of portraits of Italians, of Romans, who also have the so-called Bearistic type. So you see here 2 examples in a shoulder bust type. This is a distinctively italic type. So we know that the kind of portrait that they've chosen for their images is something that was derived or influenced by portraiture in Italy. But if you look at the other examples, or a few of the other examples from the Agora of the Italians and the area around it, you see the standard features of the Bearistic type. Again, strong wrinkles on the forehead or on the sides of the mouth, also here, and either receding hair or no hair at all. Many of these have inscriptions, but the inscriptions can't date them much beyond or much earlier than the end of the 2nd century BC. Again, we've always speculated that it must have started earlier than that point, but how early was something that we could never determine until the excavations at Kedesh, which you see here in northern Israel, an excavation that has been conducted under the auspices of the universities of Minnesota and Michigan, specifically Professor Sharon Herbert and Andrea Berlin. And in the course of excavating this site, which is a Hellenistic site, by Hellenistic I mean the period encompassing the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries BC, so the period immediately after the campaigns of Alexander the Great. As the excavations here proceeded, they found a complex dating to the first half of the 2nd century BC, so roughly 200 to 150 BC. It had been destroyed in a violent attack or a violent fire, a major fire in 150 BC. The excavators thought it might be an attack of the Maccabees, but weren't absolutely certain. But you have a wonderful destruction level, clearly dated by the pottery and the surrounding coins to 150 BC. As the what came to be known as the archive room was excavated, they sifted the earth that they found, and within the earth they found roughly 2,000 bullae. These are terracotta pegs, in a sense, terracotta roundels that were used to seal documents, official documents. And many of them have portraits on them as well as inscriptions, some of which are in Latin and some of which represent Romans in a Bearistic type. That meant that we could now fix the type's creation prior to 150 BC. So 200, 190, 180, 170, we can't fix it exactly, but it's at least earlier than the middle of the 2nd century BC. So for our purposes, let's say roughly 200 BC. It's unlikely that it's much earlier than that. But let me just say a word about bullae, because these bullae are the ones that have the portraits of Romans in Bearistic style and can be dated to the early 2nd century BC. These bullae, as I said, were used to seal documents. And this gives you an example of the way in which one of those documents could be sealed. What you would do often is write the text of your agreement, the sale of a house or a parcel of land or a military or political contract. You'd write it twice. One part would be unrolled. It would be accessible for anyone to read. The other part, which would contain the same text, would be rolled up and then bound by string, and the string would be fixed in place by one of these bullae, several examples of which you see here, and here, of course, blown up. These are about 15 millimeters in diameter, so they're extraordinarily small. That's why they would have missed them if they hadn't sieved the earth. They're the same color as the earth. They are, of course, earth in essence, and so they simply would have been missed, all 2,000 of them, if they hadn't sieved the earth as they were excavating. But in any event, they do this because if there's a question about alteration to the text at a later point, that someone has come along and altered the original agreement, they can simply go back to the other text, which has been rolled up and nicely sealed, and if it's still nicely sealed, you know it hasn't been tampered with. And you can check the text that you're questioning against the original text that's been sealed at an earlier point. And you can see in this one particular document the holes for the string on the document. Often when you look at these papyri or these rolls, you'll find holes in the center of the document and you won't know what to make of them. You think it's animals, but in fact it's the string that has sealed a part of the document. I'm showing you, by the way, here one of the seals from Kedesh and one of the seals from Delos. There are about 5,000 of these bullae or seals from Delos, so even more than Kedesh. But again, it's only the Kedesh ones that we have in an early 2nd century BC context. The Delos ones can't be fixed much beyond 100 BC. So if we can then take the origin of the type back to roughly 200 BC, if it's already in Israel before the middle of the 2nd century BC, then obviously there needs to be some time earlier than that, a lag time, when it's created and developed. And we can't, of course, fix that in place too carefully. But late 3rd, early 2nd century BC, clearly it's developed. So why would they have developed it at that particular time? This is a time when Rome is really establishing its identity as it seeks to control, bit by bit, century by century, more or less the entire Mediterranean. By the late 3rd century BC, Rome's Trojan origins had been established. As most of you know, Rome claimed Trojan descent, so claimed that the Trojan hero Aeneas had escaped the burning city of Troy prior to its destruction and gradually made his way to central Italy, where he founded the city of Lavinium, and his descendants, 400 years later, Romulus and Remus, would found the city of Rome. So Trojan ancestry had been established, and we begin to see images of Roma, the personification of Rome, on coinage wearing the so-called Phrygian cap, the cap of the East, which would later be worn by Rome's fiercest enemies who were coming from the East. So the Parthians, the successors of the Persians, would wear this kind of hat, as the Sasanians would at a later point. But if you take it all the way back, the Trojans are often depicted with this hat. So putting Roma in a Phrygian cap meant that they were acknowledging the Trojan ancestry of Rome. By the same token, the goddess Cybele, the Magna Mater, the great mother goddess, whom you see here with her consort Attis and her pet lion. This cult had been brought from northwestern Asia Minor, so from the region around Troy to Rome in the late 3rd century BC, roughly around the time when this type is established, in part because it was a way of acknowledging Rome's Trojan origins, because the great mother goddess of Anatolia was so closely associated with Troy, with the Troad, the larger area in which Troy is located, and with the Ida Mountains, which surround the southern part of the Troad. So Rome is seeking to identify itself in a very particular way, as a Trojan descendant, in opposition to some of the Greek opponents whom they were now fighting, Pyrrhus of Epirus being a case in point. At the same time, we find Rome engaged in military activities now far and wide. In the 5th century, 5th century BC, Rome had really confined its activities to central Italy. That moves further to the north and further to the south in the 4th century. And then in the 3rd century, of course, we have the period of the Punic Wars, the wars between Rome and Carthage. The first Punic Wars in the middle of the 3rd century BC, the second Punic Wars toward the end of the 3rd century BC, at which time Cybele is imported from northwestern Asia Minor to Rome. The conquerors who came back from campaigns in southern Italy, in Sicily, in North Africa during the Punic Wars, and then a little later from Macedonia and from northwestern Turkey. This was a focus of their military activities in the 2nd century BC. They would come back with as much booty as they could carry, as many purloined, as many stolen works of art, paintings, sculptures, gilt candelabra, whatever they could take from the areas that they conquered, they would bring back to Rome and parade them through the streets of the city in enormous triumphal processions. So, for example, when Aemilius Paulus, one of the great Roman generals of the 2nd century BC, is victorious in Macedonia, we hear that he brought back as many as 250 wagons of stolen art. We would call it stolen art. They would call it triumphal booty, I suppose. But you have statues, paintings, again, ornate gold and silver, all being paraded through the streets in these elaborate processions. It must have been like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. I mean, something really extraordinary, that people would look forward to seeing. In addition, they were founding temples to commemorate their victories. Some of those temples still survive. The best example of them is the so-called Round Temple in the Forum Boarium, the cattle market of ancient Rome. And you can see, of course, the Tiber River here and Tiber Island, the island right in the middle of the Tiber River over here. This temple was founded in the late 2nd century BC. It's a little later than the period that we've been discussing, but it's representative of a whole class of what we call manubial temples. By that I mean, if you were a conquering general, when you came back to Rome, you would use some of the money, some of the loot that you had taken from the area you had conquered to build something that would impress your feats, your valor, onto the minds of the Roman people, who may be in a position to elect you to the position of consul someday. It's all part of a larger political arena. And there was tremendous aristocratic competition among all these conquering generals who were coming back to Rome to see who could build the better temple ostensibly for the good of the Roman people. So these are victory temples, which really start in the 3rd century BC and continue in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. And of course, later they'll continue with the emperors. In time, the emperors in time the conquering generals, each seeking to outdo the other, began to build in marble. So this is the first marble, or one of the first marble temples built in the city of Rome. And it's extraordinary that it still stands. Many of you are familiar with this. It's often thought to be a temple to Hercules, and probably built by the Roman general Mummius in the second half of the 2nd century BC. Next to these elaborate temples, and I should add that marble doesn't seem like much to us, but the giant marble quarries in Italy hadn't yet been discovered in the second half of the 2nd century BC. So all of it had to be imported either from what is now Greece or what is now Turkey. So it was a phenomenally expensive undertaking to build in marble in the 2nd century BC, and doing it got you a lot of publicity. And so it's not surprising that as of the 2nd century BC, that's what the conquering generals started to do. Next to these temples, or in the temples, they would put some of the loot that they brought back. Now, this is elaborate material. So as I said, it's the best of what they could take from the towns that they conquered. And these are just 2 examples. Many of these statues that were brought back as booty were bronze. And these 2 you'll find in Rome in the Terme Museum, or what was once the Terme Museum, an image of a boxer, which is probably late 2nd century BC, and the image of a ruler, one of the people whom the Romans were fighting. So all of these Hellenistic kings who developed into the enemies of the Romans would have had multiple images of themselves created during the period of their greatest strength and erected in the towns over which they exercised dominion. And these portrait statues of the Hellenistic kings were also brought back to Rome and displayed in or next to some of these temples, which also featured statues of the conquering generals of Rome themselves. So we know from the literary sources, a variety of sources, Livy, Suetonius, Polybius, there are a variety of historians who write about the vast number of statues of these conquering generals that were being set up in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC, the period when we think this Bearistic type was established. All of those statues were in bronze, so we have none of them. None of them. We know of them only from the literary references and also from their appearances on coins. So you see one of Algorinus here, the statue standing on top of a large column, a kind of republican antecedent of what would later be the column of Trajan, and then additional images of conquering generals, Marcius Rex, and the great dictator Sulla in an equestrian statue that stood on the rostrum, the speaker's platform in central Rome. So these are standing next to the images that they have taken from those whom they've conquered. And so there was clearly an interest in distinguishing conqueror from conquered. You wanted to make it clear what was loot that you had taken from the regions that you had just conquered, and what kinds of images were representing the conquerors themselves, the triumphant Roman generals. So you can see here the kind of distinguishing factor that was at work. If you showed yourself with the marks of advanced age, then obviously you were going to look different from the Hellenistic kings whom you had just conquered. One example here being Mithridates VI of Pontus, the great Black Sea kingdom that was such a problem for the Romans during the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC. So one of the reasons why this particular type developed was because they were interested in a distinguishing component in the larger sculptural assemblage. It enabled the Romans to be viewed as distinct from the images of those whom they had conquered. But why would you want to use advanced age? Of all the different types or techniques that you could use to distinguish yourself from these idealized kings whom you had conquered, why would you use advanced age? What did advanced age mean, or the signs of advanced age in the later Greek and Republican period? If you start looking at images that bear the signs of advanced age immediately prior to the development of the Bearistic type for Roman generals, you find that all of the images with advanced age are either seers prophets or teachers or wise men, people who espouse an ethical code, people who are known for moral probity, philosophers as well. So it was a type of appearance that was connected with intense ethical strength and intense intellectual activity. And so you see here one of the earliest Bearistic types we have. This is just the very beginning, just some lines on the forehead and around the eyes, the so-called seer from the pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. This is early 5th century BC. But if you begin looking at cysts, boxes for toiletries of bronze that were made in the 3rd century BC, you find that those who have marks of advanced age or receding hairlines are the tutors, for example, Phoenix, the tutor of Achilles, or the tutor of Chrysippus, who's being abducted by Pelops over here. All the teachers are shown with these kinds of features, as are the prophets, as are the philosophers. And so some of you, of course, are familiar with the Bearistic type of Demosthenes, the great orator of Athens in the 4th century BC, and a whole host of philosophers. This is where you see the Bearistic type most clearly, this being an example on the portrait of Chrysippus. And we tend not to see the portrait types of the philosophers as being as close to the Bearistic style as they in fact are. But if you take Chrysippus and you shave his beard and mustache, he ends up being this character. The only difference between the Bearistic type and the philosopher type is the seated pose in which the philosophers are traditionally shown. The Bearistic type is traditionally used for standing figures, and the beard, which is a common Hellenistic addition to portraits in the 4th, 3rd, 2nd centuries BC. It's not something that you would see on the Bearistic type. But otherwise, the marks of advanced age are the same. So that's clearly one of the sources. But that's clearly not the only source. It's not just the marks of advanced age. The heads are all different. So it's almost as if the shapes of the heads are individualized based on the sitter's own physiognomy. And I began thinking about this as I started working on these bullae from Kadesh. And I turned to an idea that had been proposed as one of the sources for Roman Bearistic portraiture at an earlier point, the so-called Roman death masks. So people had often speculated on the basis of the descriptions of the so-called wax mask of the Romans that this was the basis for, or the model for, the Roman Bearistic types that were developed. And I began to investigate those wax masks and saw that they're not death masks. They're all done during one's life, these wax masks, done during your life and done at a fairly young age, when you were between the ages of roughly 35 and 40, which at this point in my life I would call young. And so it's not going to have the mark of advanced age, but it is going to illustrate the shape of the head, pretty much. If the face is long, that's going to be recorded. If the face is narrow or wide, that's going to be recorded, because you're making a cast of a person's head when you're making the wax mask. So I began to think, well, maybe there are two sources. Maybe the actual shape of the head is stemming from the wax mask that's made in one's late 30s. And maybe the marks of advanced age are then applied to that as a way of distinguishing them from the images of the conquered and tying them more to images of philosophers, seers, and teachers. That led me to investigate the making of these wax masks. Now let me just say a word about the wax masks. This is, in fact, wax, but it's not ancient. It's only 10 years old. These masks were kept in cabinets in the atrium of your house. If you were an elite landowner, an aristocrat living in Rome or Pompeii or any Italian city, you would have a house with an elaborate atrium as the first monumental space through which one would travel, with an opening in the roof directly above a pool down here. On the walls of your atrium, you would have a genealogical chart that looked very close to our genealogical charts. There were stone plaques that were used instead of paper, but stone plaques that were attached to the wall, and then cords or ribbons that moved vertically and horizontally to indicate the relationships among the different generations of a family. And some of these families would trace their descent all the way back to gods, to Aphrodite, or to Venus, to Jupiter, even to Pasiphae, the woman who gave birth to the Minotaur, half man, half bull, on a beach in Crete. The idea was to be able to trace your descent back to the heroic age. But you were presented in the context of your family in the first room of your house, and that was the first image that one would have seen upon entering it. And in the cabinets that were also kept in this room would have been the wax masks of your ancestors. Now, these wax masks would have been made when the ancestors were still alive. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. They are not death masks. But when you reach the rank of Edile, A-E-D-I-L-E, one of the high Roman officials, you would be entitled to have a wax mask of your face made. And then later, when you died, that wax mask of yours would go to your descendant, your eldest son. And then it would be passed on. Probably these would be mass-produced at a certain point, depending upon how many children you had. But that's a more speculative issue. And then later on, when there was a funeral, so your father has died, then you would take out all the wax masks in your cabinet that go back 5, 6, 7, 8 generations. You would look for members of your family who had the same physique as the deceased member whom you were remembering, and then that person would put on the mask of the deceased person. So if your great-great-grandfather was fat, you would look around to your cousins, find the fattest one, and then that one would wear the mask of the great-great-grandfather and would go up to the rostrum, and something would be said about the great-great-grandfather in the context of the funeral service. So again, in the context of the funeral, you were presented, even though you're dead, you're presented in the context of your family. So all of the achievements of your ancestors are being extolled in the course of the service. And these wax masks play a prominent role in that. Okay, now how were these made? Since I was going to write about them, I decided I had to have one made of my own face. How else could I be certain of the process? So I shaved my beard, which is de rigueur if you're having a plaster cast of your face made. Otherwise, it would be excruciatingly painful. And that clearly is one of the reasons why nobody wears a beard in the late Republic. So I only used techniques that would have been available to the Romans during the 1st century BC, 2nd and 1st centuries BC. So that meant coating my face with olive oil at the beginning, which I can't believe they didn't do, and then taking strips of plaster or strips of linen. We only used linen, which of course would have been available to the Romans, soaking the linen in plaster, and then gradually applying the plaster strips to my face. This was the only deference to, or the only modern element that we used, which made the plaster dry faster, the fan. But as you see, gradually the strips of plaster are put throughout my face, and then it hardens. We were going to do this as a workshop today, but not enough people signed up. In fact, only one person signed up. It's painless, and it takes 15 minutes, but it will harden, and then your mask maker will just peel the mask, the plaster mask, off your face, and that is your mold for the wax mask. You then take the plaster mask, the plaster mold that has just been created, you put it in water, and then after it dries, you paint the wax on the inside of the mask, because again, it's functioning as a mold. So here we're heating the wax. This is another indication of modern additions, because we were using a burner, as the Romans would not have, but they would have melted wax in the same way. Then painting it on the inside of the plaster mold. Also, you see us doing that here. We put some cloth on the inside of the mask to give it a little more texture. And then you simply peel the wax mask out of the plaster mold, and you paint it lifelike colors, as we have not done here. And then you can simply wear it. You simply put it on your face. And this must have been the technique that they used when they were making them in antiquity. And after the lecture, you can actually come up and see it. I did bring it in. Now, the ones that were used by the Romans would surely have been less ghoulish than this, because, as I wear it, even though it is my face, I look like one of those characters in Friday the 13th. the axe murderers. They were some sort of serial killer. So they would have painted them more naturalistic colors, which I keep meaning to do but have not yet done. And these would have been worn during the funeral. So this would have captured the exact frame of the face, which I think was probably one of the components of these Bearistic portraits. One of the problems you run in with this type of portrait organization is that you're trying to commemorate the high ethical codes, the morals, the honesty of the sitter, of the person whose portrait is being made. At the same time, that man is a conquering general, and so there needs to be some indication of martial prowess that is denied by the exaggerated effects of age on the face. So if you're going to convey martial prowess together with moral probity, and the moral probity is defined as advanced age, you have to have a heavily muscled body to indicate the martial prowess, which is what you see they did. And that resulted in a very uneven link between portrait and body. So if you look at the portrait itself in isolation, and these two do join, they were found together. This part has been smashed, but it is a single statue. The portrait itself is of the Bearistic type with the advanced age. If you look at this, you would probably say it was someone in their 50s or 60s. If you look at the body attached to it, this is surely someone in their 20s, conceivably 30s, but no older. And so you're trying to do two things with these kinds of portraits, as I say. Show someone who's strong in war and who's honest in politics. And putting them together, again, results in this disjunction of age. So one part of the body is several decades younger than the other part of the body. You see this from time to time in different types of art for different kinds of characters. So the other famous example would be the image of God the Father on the Sistine ceiling, painted by Michelangelo, where God the Father has been given a Bearistic type, but he's been given a very heavily muscled body, so that the net result is that there appear to be several decades separating the age of the head from the age of the body, even though they've obviously put this hospital gown on God the Father because you can't have him naked in a Christian context. But the concept, the sense of a gap between the ages of head and body are the same as what you see in this image of the so-called general from Tivoli just outside Rome. I said that I would go back to the issue of marble. Why is it that all the portrait types that we have in the Bearistic style are made of marble? And all of those seem to date between 60 and 40 BC. As I mentioned, marble was a precious commodity during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, even into the early 1st century BC, because it all had to be imported either from the area around Athens, or from one of the Aegean islands, or from the island of Proconnesus in the Sea of Marmara, between Troy and Constantinople or Istanbul. And so the only images that were made in marble were the images of the gods. So you see here, for example, in the area of the Largo Argentina in central Rome, with 4 victory temples, each one of these built by a conquering general. The circular one, which you see here, was dedicated to Fortuna, whose portrait and arm were actually excavated in the temple. So it's a circular temple like the temple of Hercules that I showed you earlier. And at this point in time, the end of the 2nd century BC, only the gods are going to get the marble. We have inscriptions that indicate clearly that marble was considered more valuable than bronze. So the humans are portrayed in bronze and the gods in marble until the middle of the 1st century BC, when the quarries at Carrara near La Spezia, just southeast of Genoa in northwestern Italy, are discovered and begin to be quarried on a massive scale. Suddenly, marble was available in Italy, a lot of it very cheaply. And then we start getting a lot of images in marble. We get a whole host of buildings in central Rome that are built in marble, as well as the colonial cities. And we get images of the conquering generals that are now made in marble because it was a far cheaper medium. And so that's why we have the change in medium from bronze to marble roughly in the middle of the 1st century BC because of the opening of the Carrara quarries at that particular time. I said that we tend to think of the Bearistic style as being traditional for the Roman Republican man, the Roman Republican aristocrat or conquering general. But that style goes out of popularity as of the end of the 1st century BC with the victory of Augustus over the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. He is in the process of starting a dynasty, and there's a new look for the dynasty that he's interested in establishing. That new look is one of eternal youth and idealization. It is the antithesis of the Bearistic style. So portraits of Augustus, who lived to his 70s, that were made when he was in his 70s, make him look 20. Now, everybody looked young no matter how old they were, whereas with the Bearistic style, people looked old no matter how young they were. It was a complete about-face, and it must have been a startling change in the streets of Rome to see such a change in the portrait types that were being dedicated. So you see Augustus, his adopted son Tiberius here, his grandson Agrippa Posthumus, Augustus's grandson Agrippa Posthumus, an image of Gaius, Augustus's eldest adopted son. All of the people in the dynasty have this uniform idealization, no physical imperfections, perfect noses, no crow's feet, no lines on the forehead, no lines on either side of the mouth, no bags, no sags, no wrinkles of any kind. So this is what it must have been like as you're walking through the streets of Rome. On the Republican side of the street, you see a whole host of images that look like this. The early imperial images are all looking like this. And it's the sort of change that we've seen frequently in our own time in presidential politics, as I will move to in a second. But this doesn't mean that the Bearistic style was over for good. As I said, Augustus and the dynasty that he was creating are linked to the idealization, the so-called Julio-Claudian classicism. And that will continue throughout the rest of the dynasty, which ends with Nero. He's the last emperor within the Augustan and Julio-Claudian dynasty, committing suicide in 68 because he knew that what awaited him was going to be far worse. And the images of Nero show him a little more portly than his predecessors, but there are still the idealizing tendencies in the portraiture, as there had been in the portraits of his forefather Augustus. And then with the next dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, we move back to the Bearistic type. It was a definite political move, where Vespasian, the first emperor of the new dynasty, wanted to make it clear to the people of Rome that everything had just changed, that the excesses of the Julio-Claudian dynasty are now over, that the Republic was going to be revived by him, and that good, honest, solid Republican values would now be the order of the day. And as a way of communicating that in one instant to the Roman people, he went back to the Bearistic style. So as many lines on his forehead, around the sides of the eyes, on the cheeks, no hair, etc., etc. Everybody starts looking old again, no matter how young they were, as a reaction to the Julio-Claudian excesses. So it has renaissances, this Bearistic style, as one goes through the Roman Empire, with periods of idealization, the Bearistic style, idealization, the Bearistic style, as emperors continually used it to say or to stress the fact that they were reviving the values of the Republic, even though, of course, the world had been an empire for several hundred years. And I mentioned that one sees these tendencies occurring also in modern presidential portraiture. Those images that I just showed you of the Bearistic portrait type next to the portrait type of Augustus with his youthful idealization. As one moved through the streets of America in 1960, 1961, one would have seen the same kind of sudden change in portrait types for the rulers of the country, from the Bearistic style of Dwight Eisenhower to the youthful idealization of John Kennedy. It's the same sort of thing as what you would have seen in 31 BC after the Battle of Actium. And one sees these remnants of ancient Rome throughout presidential portraiture and American national imagery, if one begins to sit down and look at it. As I mentioned, there are renaissances of this Bearistic style, and that's true in presidential portraits as well. So you go from Bearistic under Dwight Eisenhower to idealization under John Kennedy to Bearistic again under Lyndon Johnson, who looks just like Vespasian, if you think about it. And if you were to look at the personifications of America, so we call those personifications of America Columbia, you see that she too was wearing the Phrygian cap, just as the early images of Roma had been. The early images of Roma are wearing the Phrygian cap as a way of stressing Rome's Trojan ancestry. In this case, obviously America does not claim Trojan ancestry, but it was a cap that had developed into a symbol of liberty, and that's why it's used. But you put this next to images of Roma, and the two look almost identical. One can see this disconnect in age between head and body type also by looking at presidential portraits, this being a case in point, the image of George Washington by Horatio Greenough, which is now in the Smithsonian Institution, where you have the Bearistic portrait type and then the youthful idealized body of Jupiter for the same reason that that general from Tivoli, or the image of God the Father on the Sistine Chapel, had a disconnect between age of head and age of body, because you want to convey military prowess coupled with moral probity, and you can't do that if head and body represent a person of the same age. A few years ago, there was a book written called Are We Rome by Cullen Murphy that was intended to draw parallels between America and the Roman Empire, primarily linked to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by comparison to Rome's wars in the East during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries AD. And although many would argue that that is stretching it a little too much, nevertheless, when we look at American presidential portraiture in connection with the development of the Bearistic style in the Roman Republic, you can see that the connections, the links, the similarities between Rome and America are much greater than you might initially have thought. Thank you for coming to the lecture. Thank you for your support of the museum. That's it. Yes, a question. You know, I was president of the Archaeological Institute of America for 4 years. I aged dramatically during that period. Let me tell you, I didn't have any gray hair when I started. I didn't have any sags, bags, or wrinkles. I've got a lot now. The lights are low here on stage, so you might not notice, but in fact, they're there. So any president, anyone who has that much responsibility for 4 years is going to age. Do I think that they're deliberately aging themselves as a way of conveying their moral probity to the American people? I don't. I doubt it. Some of them may have done so. I can't believe that Lyndon Johnson didn't think of that at a certain point. He wanted people to see that he was worried about the American war and the Vietnam War and the American economy. And so I can imagine that he said to the photographers, I want some shadow that emphasizes my wrinkles. I can imagine that he did that. The only ones who would really know are the presidential photographers. But the images of Lyndon Johnson, if you do a Google image search, there's nothing idealized there. Now, he was hardly Rock Hudson, Lyndon Johnson. I mean, he was not a looker by a long shot. But you could still have cleaned him up with proper lighting and makeup, and that was never done. He looked as old as he possibly could. So I think that was probably a deliberate embracing of the Bearistic style, although I can't say that with certainty. Other questions? Yes? Yeah, because they're serious. Moral probity and seriousness. They're worried, they're concerned about the fate of the Roman Republic. They wanted the portrait to serve as an indication of the extent to which they were concerned about the Roman Republic. So you never see them smiling. If you go to the revival of the Bearistic type in the 3rd century AD, which is often christened the Age of Anxiety, they're downright scowling as a way of indicating the extent to which they're concerned about the fate of the empire. But you're perfectly right. There are no positive emotions injected into this. Yes, you had a question. one of the business centers. Mhm. Well, the Agora of the Italians is not getting started until after 166, when Delos becomes a free port. So those particular images on Delos do not date as early as the bullae on Kedesh. That's the whole point. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Yep, that's certainly right. Well, yes, I would say yes and no. The images of the businessmen, qua businessmen, are restricted to Delos. The ones that are being set up in Rome are primarily focused on politicians and generals. You wouldn't get one for being a successful businessman. Mhm. Right. I think he clearly said to his portraitists, we are not the Julio-Claudians. Make that clear to everyone right now. And the shift in style was the direct byproduct of that. But I think certainly there are other issues that are involved in the formation of the way in which Vespasian chose to present himself to the people, as you've articulated. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's you. Yeah. Yeah, otherwise you can't do it. It won't work unless you have a plaster mold. Well, you can't apply melted wax to a person's face. You just can't. That would be cruel. That would be the Inquisition. If it were the Inquisition, you could. But otherwise, you need to have the mold. Why don't you just hold it for a minute? I always give my students the opportunity to hold this mask, and they just retreat when they see me coming. No, there are no recipes. I had to figure it out myself. I knew that, I spoke to a lot of artists, and I said, okay, to make a wax mask, there are only so many ways you can do it. I mean, it's not like you're building a nuclear bomb. There are a limited number of ways that it will succeed. And they all said the same thing. The only way you can do it is by making a plaster mold first. There's no other way. So I simply considered the kinds of materials that they would have had access to and used those in the process of making this. But it won't work unless you do it via a plaster mold. I did it in Cincinnati, in fact. Tina is not here. I don't know what kind of plaster it was. We were going to do this in a workshop, and Tina came to me and said, it's saying here on the package for the plaster, may cause burns to the face, or something like that. And I can email you what, I actually went back to the woman who did it and said, what kind of plaster did you use? And she used some sort of sculptor's plaster. No, it's not bad. I mean, it's a little warm, but, you're not burned. Didn't get masks. Women did not get masks. Yeah, and more uniform in age. So the Bearistic style is used for men. You almost never find it used for women, except once the freedmen start representing themselves using the Bearistic style that their former owners had used. And then the women, the wives of the freed slaves, will start to use it. But the women of the Republic, of course, how many portraits of women from the Republic do we have? Not so many. But they don't look old. None of them look old. They don't get it. It's the men who get it. Well, the one you're thinking of that looks sort of Bearistic upstairs, that's 3rd century AD. When, that's long after the Republican period. So by that point, it was an option that some women chose. But in the Republic, they didn't. You just don't find it. There were other questions. Yes? Did the sculptors sign their works? Some did. It depended on where you were coming from and how famous your city was for sculpture. So one of the most famous of the cities was Aphrodisias in southwestern Turkey for sculpture, and they always signed. Some of them were brought by the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD to do sculptures to decorate his villa in Tivoli, and those are all signed. So sometimes you do get the sculptor signatures if I think it was a way of increasing the value of a piece. If it was done by an Aphrodisian sculptor, then that piece was going to rise in value, more so than it would have if it were done by someone from Pisa, because that was not so famous for sculpture. So sometimes they did, not always, but more frequently than we think. No. We have, for the Republican period, the main person we know of, we don't have any of his sculptures that are signed, but there was a man named Pasillas who was credited with reviving classicism. What the Roman writer Pliny said that art stopped in 296 BC after the death of the great Greek sculptor Lysippus, and then sculpture just went haywire. It became too excessive, too Baroque, as it were. And then in the 2nd century BC, they revived the styles of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. So in Pliny's mind, they were correct again in the way they were approaching the human form, and art started again. And he links that to Pasillas. But we don't have a lot of names of great sculptors for Rome in the same way that we do for the Greek period, with Polyclitus, Phidias, Cresselis, etc. Okay, I used a fan. So it hardened in 15 minutes, but I did sit in front of a fan. If I hadn't sat in front of the fan, I think it would have certainly hardened in 30 minutes. It doesn't take very long. And then once it hardens, you just peel it off because, of course, you have olive oil on your skin. So it will just peel off very easily, and you don't feel any negative side effects. It's very easy. You can pass around the mask. I don't know if anyone... Oh, yeah, all right. Any other questions? Yes? Well, there are about 350 of them. So yes, one could. There are any number of good examples to which one could point. Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming, and please enjoy the Lod Mosaic. And you can go up to the Mediterranean section now and look at a few Bearistic types.